Hi, in this video I'm going to give a quick run through of the workflow that I use when I work in R. And that workflow involves using RMarkdown or RMarkdown files in RStudio. So if you want an example RMarkdown file, there's one for you to grab right there. And you can just go through that. It's pretty self-explanatory and do all the things that it says to do. But I wanted to show you live a few features of the interface and the way that I use it. So when you open up that file in RStudio, it should look something like this. And you're going to be doing all your work up here in the upper left quadrant. That's called the source pane. And the main feature of R Markdown files, they're just text. So the reason I like to use R Markdown files is you can put whatever text in there you want, whatever notes you want to yourself. But the main feature that they have is the ability to execute R code, and that's what you use code chunks for. So there's a code chunk in this file right here on lines 13 through 17. And you can see it, the only thing that distinguishes a code chunk is that beginning line and the end line with the 3 backwards accents. So you can play a code chunk and that'll execute the R code that's in there. So this code right here is just simple arithmetic. And you could go ahead and modify it, right? And do it again. And get your answer. But the nice thing about working in code chunks like this is a reproducible workflow. So once you get something to work, you've got it written there with your notes, and you can figure out how you did it, and you can go back later and do it again. One thing that happens when you execute a code chunk is those commands get executed in what's called the console. So you might have to bump this window up and make it a little bigger so you can see where the console is. So notice the commands that I was just doing using the code chunk were echoed down here in the console. You can also type things directly into the console and they'll execute in the console. But they won't execute in your document. The only things that will execute in your document are things that you put up there. So the console you can use if you want to experiment and not mess up your document, just to try to remind yourself how certain commands work. When you want to save an answer that you might use later, save the result of a computation, you use the assignment statement and you assign it to a variable name. So right there on line 32, you can see a variable name called my answer, and it's 54 divided by 6. So when you execute that code chunk, it looks like nothing happens, but what happened is up here in the upper right, in the environment tab, it shows you my answer 9. So it keeps track of anything you assign to a variable name. And the reason you need to know this is because you're going to want to input data into R and work with it. So here on line 42 is a command to input a comma-separated variable file called crickets. So notice when I hit play on that, I get a new thing up here in my environment tab called crickets. If I expand it, I see that crickets has 3 variables: species, temp, and pulse. If I wanted to refer to those variables separately, I would refer to them using the following notation. So if I wanted the temperature of all the crickets, I'd do the name of the data frame, crickets, $, temp. The crickets is the name of the data frame, and the temp is the name of the variable. Let me show you in the console what you can do there. So bring this console window back. I can say, I want to see the temperatures of all the crickets. So I do crickets $temp, and then it gives me a listing of all the temperatures. You could also go here and say, take the mean of that column, and you'd get the mean of crickets $temp. It can be handy to be able to work with individual columns. Another thing that's handy is viewing the data as a spreadsheet. You can do that by clicking on the name of the data frame in the environment tab. Click on that. Then it opens up a new tab And so notice you have the 3 columns here, species, temp, and pulse, in a more user-friendly format. It looks like a spreadsheet. Now, it isn't a spreadsheet because you can't edit, and the columns all have to be the same length. Data in R, the best practice is to do 1 line per observational unit. So notice each line of this data frame represents a cricket, and for each cricket, we know its species, we know its temperature, and we know its pulse. Once you have data inputted into R, it's super easy to do statistical tests on it. For example, down here in line 52, a t-test is done using this syntax. Notice crickets is the name of the data frame, then temp is the response variable, and species is the explanatory variable. Species is the grouping variable. So that's a t-test on 2 independent groups, and the output looks like the output you're used to seeing in any old statistical package. For example, you could also do a regression. So a regression is a 2-line command, but again, anybody who's familiar with SPSS or SAS would be able to interpret the output that you get from these R calls. If you want to know how to do other tests in R, there's this great website. If you shift-click on a link in RStudio, it opens it up in your web browser. Choosing the correct statistical test. So this is a website from the UCLA Department of Statistics. And it tells you how to do the test in SAS, Stata, SPSS, or R. And notice, if you know the name of your test, you just find that. And if you're confused about what test you can use, it even tells you, okay, well, say what the dependent variables, what the independent variables are, and it'll tell you what test to use. So there's a wealth of information on that page. And pretty much all you have to do once you get your data into RStudio is check out the R code for whatever test you want to do and paste that into a code block in RStudio, and you're all set. One last thing I want to show you is how to convert this document to something that's a little more user-friendly. Up here at the top, well, notice you can save your file, just like you can in any old program. But there's this other curious button called knit. So if you click on knit, what happens? What you'll notice is it might ask you to install some things at some point. And if RStudio ever asks you to install something, you can trust it and just tell it to go ahead and install. It's just installing extra packages so it can do things. Here, it's knitted my document into an HTML file. And so notice it's a lot easier to read. It's all formatted. The code chunks are set off in boxes. Even like plots show up if I told it to do any plots. I can also open that in a web browser, and that's a regular old web browser. That's Chrome. So if I wanted, for example, to give somebody the result of this regression for whatever reason, I could just go ahead and copy that, Control C, paste it into an email in Gmail, and it would come back, it would format the email. It would look just like it looks here. So it's a way that I often answer people's questions over email. They send me the question, I go ahead and do the analysis in an RMarkdown document, then I send them back the results in an email like this. And notice it gives you the R code as well as the output. So it's reproducible in that sense. Somebody else could use RStudio to get the same answers. One other thing I want to show you is how I like to customize this interface. In the Tools menu, if I go to Tools, Global Options, my preference for appearance, you've got all these different choices. My preference is a darker theme, so Solarized Dark I think looks pretty good. And the RMarkdown behavior that I prefer is not to show the output in a pop-up window, but rather to show it in a viewer pane. Click on Viewer Pane, apply those changes, and that's what my RStudio interface looks like most of the time. It's easier on the eyes, I think. And it's also easier because when you knit, it just shows over here and you're not constantly switching between windows. That's about it. What I would recommend is grab this file, rmarkdownworkflow.rmd, and experiment with it. You can put in your own code blocks. Oh, incidentally, one thing I forgot to mention, if you want to put in a code block, there's this handy insert thing. And all that does is give you the first line and the last line of the code block, right? R is fun. Give it a number. Play. R is fun. Okay, so that's how you make your own code block. So again, go ahead, you could try to get your own data into R. You can try to use the data that's there. I'll give you some other worksheets with more statistical tests and more ways to get data in there and better ways to do plots. But this should get you started.